Hey everyone. Well, I was going to say welcome back to all of you, but it's actually more of a other way around because I have been away on holidays for the past week. When I set the launch date for the Huevos Knit Along, I managed to completely forget about the fact, hey Elsa Louise, nice to see you. Completely forgot about the fact that we had a bank holiday Monday here. But I reckon that doing a live with all of you wasn't really work, right? So in theory, I'm still on holidays. So this is just a little holiday live to kick off the knit along and to to open up the floor to any questions you might have and things like that. So anyone who's not already joined into the Huevos Knit Along, you jump right in now. Just get the pattern. If you've got a cotton yarn or a plant fiber yarn, will all work really nicely for the stitch pattern, or you could get a Huevos coral yarn kit from the shop. If you're newer to lace knitting and to doing decreases in lace and things like that, you may also instead opt to get the workshop, because there's going to be a lot of videos and backup on the backside. Hey Riverview Knitting, it's nice to be back. I feel nice and refreshed. Oddly enough, I actually was under the weather the last couple of days. Nothing in particular, just really tired. And then I woke up today and I kind of felt like myself again. And it's such a huge relief. And the weather in Ireland is kind of back to normal again. It's a little bit grey, a little bit overcast, not too cold, not too hot. Very middle of the road, very Irish is all I can say. So if you are going to be joining us on the Huevos Knit Along, please just put up your questions here as we're going along. If there's something that you'd like answered or you'd like me to kind of refer to specifically to. Otherwise, I might go through a few points that have kind of come up so far and can kind of go from there. So the first one that I kind of talked a little bit about in the pattern was how to create, hang on, I'm going to bring Huevos, my lady, in here with me. How to work open edge stitches, because this is done from the bottom up, but you initially start with actually I can use this one because this is the other version. You initially start down here with a split hem. Now, when I was starting off the first one over here, I was re-knitting the pattern and I hadn't done it in a while. But what you're actually going to be doing, and I kind of cottoned on once I reached up here, when you're starting at the beginning of every row of garter stitch, you're actually slipping the first stitch and then you're knitting on. Benefit of doing that is it actually creates, like you're slipping them knitwise in this case, so it actually creates very defined garter stitch kind of nubs, and it gives a nice clean edge. Because otherwise, if you don't do that and you just knit right from the start, you've probably experienced it yourself. With the selvage, that edge stitch can sometimes be a little messy. It tends to be a small bit looser than the rest of the stitches. So slipping the first stitch like this as you work along gives this nice, when you slip it knitwise, it gives a really nice little edging along the edge. I didn't do it right down on the bottom. Let me pick this up here. So if you see on the edge here, it's just going to, you've got, it looks almost the same, but it's just a little less crisp. So I hadn't done it there, and that's what it's going to turn out like if you don't do it. So not the end of the world, but it definitely does help. I've had Elsa Louise, you wanted the adding cap sleeves instructions. Okay, what I'll probably do, I'll talk a little bit about how you could potentially add a cap sleeve, because there was a few people asking about that. I'm not going to write the pattern out in total. What I will do is I'll give guidance, and I'll kind of just, it'll be worded rather than actually written into the pattern, if that makes sense. But I will kind of describe what we're trying to do here as well, so that you can give it a shot yourself if you want to put that addition onto it. The other things I've been thinking about here is when you're starting at the bottom, because you're starting with garter stitch, which isn't quite as stretchy in general as lace. So usually you don't want to have too tight a cast on when you're doing it. The type of cast on is not terribly important. Like you don't need a super stretchy one like you'd have for a pair of socks or something like that. That's not necessary. Just something that has got enough give that the garter stitch isn't going to be gathered in at the bottom. So I did in the pattern, I went ahead and did a long tail cast on, or I usually do the thumb method of the long tail cast on. And just when I'm doing it, I make sure that I don't yank the stitches too tightly, because you can actually have a big variation in how tightly the cast on is done, depending on how tightly you pull it as you're going along. So just be aware of not pulling the yarn too strongly in between each cast on stitch, and then that's just going to give it a little bit more give, because there's more yarn obviously in the actual cast on itself. So if you've never done that before, you've never looked at how tight or how loosely you do a cast on, you can even do a small swatch and experiment and see if I actually tighten up very firmly between each of these stitches. Because you know, when you put a stitch on and then you kind of tighten the yarn before you go on to the next one, do 2 little swatches, one where you tighten it kind of almost as much as you can, and the other one where you leave a little bit of slack. And then if you knit a few rows into each of those, you'll very quickly start seeing how much of a difference it makes in the flexibility of that cast on edge. So that is, I think that is quite important really with something like this. And the other question that was coming up this morning was looking at lace stitches, and specifically gauge with different yarns. So like these are 2 quite different yarns. This is the first one, and I'm upside down again. It's a sports weight yarn, again, which this is sports weight, but it's linen, and it's a lighter yarn. It's a lighter yarn, but it happily knits to a looser gauge. So same needle size, lighter yarn, so when you are blocking it, it's going to open out more, and it gives a much thinner and finer fabric. This one, it's also a sports weight yarn, but it's a slightly heavier yarn, and it's the same needle size. So when you block it, you don't have to block it quite as aggressively, because it's going to, you just don't need it to stretch quite as much. So really what I find with that is, with lace, it is quite forgiving of gauge. So what you really want to do is try a couple of different needle sizes and see which one is easy to knit with, because sometimes the needle size might be too tight and so it's very stiff, or it might be so big that it's feeling very sloppy. So to get one where you can get a nice rhythm and the lace flows a little bit more smoothly off the needles is very helpful, I think. And then on top of that, what you want to make sure you do when you block, because these are all plant fibers are much less elastic. So with a wool yarn, for instance, if you block it, you can stretch it quite a bit, but it's going to bounce back to the original position. With plant fibers, you can block, particularly in lace, you can be very gentle with blocking like this so that it's less open, or you can be more aggressive, as in when you're aggressively blocking, you're stretching it to the gauge you want. And unlike wool, where if you do that and then you take it off, you'll get a certain amount of bounce back. Like, it won't come right back to the size it was, but it will bounce in a little bit. Don't find with plant fibers, they don't have that elasticity, so you're not going to get quite the same amount of bounce back to the actual stitches when you're doing it. So I would try, experiment with a few needle sizes, and then after that, make sure you block your swatch and take it off the, whatever you've got pinning it out, take it off, give it a shake out, maybe leave it sit for a day to see how much it comes back in, to give you an idea. But the 2 differences as well, like this one, because of the lace actually being stretchy, it's designed and worn in the sample with an inch, or either 1 inch or half an inch of negative ease. And what that means is that when you've got it blocked and laid out, the size is smaller than the bust size, and then you're relying on the fact that lace is super stretchy so that it can still be worn. This one I actually sized up, and it actually meant that it's worn with a little bit of positive ease, so you're not getting a very stretched lace effect. Both actually work great. It's personal opinion as to which way you think you prefer the lace looks and which would feel more comfortable on you. Elsa Louise, wood or metal needles? I'm not sure if it must have been the last live, I was talking a small little bit about this, and I was actually surprised that I found the wooden needles far more enjoyable to knit this with. The reason I was surprised is that I had just done Dusty Roads, which is all in the coral yarn, same yarn as I did for this. and I used the metal needles, and because it's mainly stockinette stitch, the stitches flowed very smoothly, and I found it very easy to get the stitches off the needle and had a nice rhythm to it. So I just kind of assumed that the metal needles would be what would be most comfortable for this. And I started working with it, and I just found that I was having a very hard time with the lace. It wasn't gripping, I was having to hold the stitches, and it didn't have a nice rhythm and a comfortable knit. So I just thought I'd experiment, and I went ahead and tried out the bamboo needles, and it was a million times more pleasant. Because for me personally, I just found that when I was knitting lace with cotton, I needed a small bit more grip so that I wasn't fighting with the stitches, and they stayed in place and I was able to maneuver. But that is definitely a personal decision. So if you're finding one doesn't seem to allow it to flow very smoothly, perhaps pull out another one and give an experiment with that. You may also find that even changing to something like, a cubic, the square needles gives you a little bit more grip, or maybe one of the ergonomic needles or something like that. So if it doesn't feel very comfortable, just experiment a little bit more with different needle types, and it will make a difference. But you will discover, I think, that the lace in this is very forgiving in terms of gauge. So feel free to kind of experiment a little bit and play around with it, and see what you like. And I would suggest blocking a swatch and seeing how it comes out, and if it holds its shape after it comes off the blocking board and you unpin the whole thing. So so if you look at the cast on and the gauge and the lace, and the big question that's been coming up is looking at sleeve caps. So the first thing I want to show you here is, if I turn this around and you take a look at her here, you can see that this is actually designed with an almost racerback style, because these come in quite far. Now that is going to be a little bit of a problem if you want to go ahead and add sleeve caps, because these are not sitting on the edge of your shoulders, they're sitting quite far in. So if you want to go ahead and add sleeve caps, the first thing you're going to want to do is these decreases along here, you're going to want less. And so what that will mean is that you've got more stitches up here. So instead of it being here, it's going to sit a little bit further out. So once that's done, then it'll sit on the edge of your shoulder. When you're doing that, I'd also would suggest doing it in multiples of 3, because your lace stitch pattern is multiples of 3. And when you finish your decreases here, it's multiples of 3, and that means that you're going to have, when you come up along here for this straight stretch, it's all going to be in the full lace pattern. If it's not, and you really want to change it a little bit outside of that multiple of 3, then you're just going to probably have some stitches that are going to be in knit along the edge here, because they won't fit into the lace pattern. Or you could possibly, if you wanted to, even have a wider garter stitch band, but I think you're better off with them just as a knit stitch going up along here. So that's the first thing you want to do if you would like to put a sleeve cap on, is you want to have a wider shoulder, so it's closer to the edge of your shoulders as opposed to up here. And then, so that means that when you've got your band across here, instead of just having those, I'll put her in picture here, instead of just having those 8 stitches, I think what you should have then is probably a little bit further, so it's wider, and it's more of a shoulder width rather than a little strap up here. So I think that's really important to start with. And once you have that, then the next thing that you're going to want to do for the sleeve cap is, if any of you have done top-down sleeves with me, it's identical, the technique, but the only difference being that you never get beyond the short row sleeve cap. So you pick up stitches, you start to the middle of the bottom, pick up stitches all the way around the armhole, and again, it doesn't really matter how many you pick up, you just pick a ratio, probably 1 stitch for every garter bump, so every other row as you're picking up should probably work pretty well. And then you'll take about the top third or the top quarter here, and just begin working 1 stitch back and forth like this. I actually think that because the rest of it, you've got garter and lace in this, lace would be quite tricky to put in short rows, but I'm actually thinking the garter stitch might work, or you could even add in stockinette stitch, which will work really well. But like once you work back and forth like that, for adding one extra stitch each time you turn, you're going to create this little short row top, and then you just bind off your stitches all the way around. So you never complete the whole sleeve cap, because that would bring it all the way down here. You're usually only going to do something that's maybe 2-3 inches deep, so not very deep, and then bind off. So the real big question is what the stitch pattern is, and I have my suspicions. I think garter stitch could work really nicely with that. Now, if you're doing it and you find it's flaring out too much, you have too many stitches, so you probably want to undo, pick up less stitches, and do the same thing again. But I do think that you need to make the decision before you get started with the sleeve cap by not having as many decreases along here, so that you have full shoulders up at the top rather than just a little strap. Now, anyone who's actually doing the knit along with me, I'll post up a little bit more about that in the Knit Hub, and I'll also put it up in the Teachable class. So I'll put a new section on optional sleeve caps during the week, and the kind of things you'll need to change, and just ideas of ratios and stuff like that, as opposed to, it won't be an entire pattern edition, but there should be enough information there for you to have a fairly good grasp on what you're trying to do and the kind of changes you want to make. So does that make sense to any of you out there? I know Elsa, where are you? Looking down here. Yeah, it was Elsa Louise, you had been asking me about that. Does that make sense to you, those changes that you'd need to make to add a sleeve cap? Obviously with a small little bit more wording online that you can do. Yes, I'll take that as a yes. If it's not, then please let me know. Now, that kind of gives, hopefully this is enough to kind of get started with your knit along. Please jump into the Knit Hub, so that, oh good, Elsa, is it Elsa Louise? I think it is, yes. Please jump into the Knit Hub and just get chatting with each other there. And I love the fact that with the Knit Hub, it all pops straight up into my phone, so I immediately see anything that's appearing. On Teachable, it takes a little bit longer because I have to log into the website and there doesn't seem to be any push notifications to me. So I have to remember to jump in, which is a little dangerous because when you're on holidays, you don't see things like that. But yeah, during the week, I'll be more regularly checking into that. But I may do, if you've got more questions, pop them up here or put them into the forum. And I think I'll do not an Instagram live next time, perhaps a YouTube live, because that way we can also have some chat down the side and you can fire some questions up. Anyone who's missed this, I'm going to go and save it, and so you can access back to it with all of the information that we talked about, and I'll pop it up into the Teachable workshop as well. So I hope you're all enjoying your start and you're liking knitting with Coral, if you're working on Coral or otherwise, and pop lots of questions, photos, everything up, so that we can actually get this rolling and get a bit of excitement going and get our summer knitting started. Even if we're halfway through the summer, you'll have one for next summer, or if you're down under, then you'll be ready in time for your summer, which is very convenient. All right, bye everyone.